The morning air in Vatican City stood still as an official communiqué echoed through the Holy See. Pope Francis has passed into eternal rest. The announcement struck like thunder across global news outlets, leaving billions stunned. Though the Pope had faced health challenges in recent years, the timing was unexpected. At 88, the beloved pontiff had defied odds with his stamina and resolve. His death marked the end of a profound spiritual chapter for the Catholic Church. Immediately, bells tolled across St. Peter's Square. Thousands gathered in silence, tears blending with candlelight and prayers. The Vatican's press secretary, with a trembling voice, confirmed the news live. He died peacefully in his sleep. Pope Francis had often joked about not wanting a grand farewell, but the Church knew his departure would demand a tribute worthy of history. The world entered mourning, not just the faithful, but leaders of every faith and continent. Maria Elena breaks down. He died the way he lived, with love. Maria Elena Bergoglio, Pope Francis's only surviving sibling, stood at the Vatican's private chapel, her voice cracking as she addressed a sea of mourners. Dressed in simple black, she clutched her brother's rosary, the same one he carried during his morning meditations. "He lived with compassion. He died with grace," she whispered. Behind her, the Pope's wooden casket, adorned with white lilies, rested beneath Michelangelo's solemn ceiling. Maria Elena revealed private memories: his habit of praying for homeless children at night, his handwritten letters to her, his dreams of reforming the Church from the inside. "He told me his only fear was leaving the world unchanged, but he did change it," she cried. Cameras captured the intimate moment, broadcasting it to millions around the world. Her grief wasn't just personal. It was shared by Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Pope Francis's sister had become the voice of the world's broken heart. St. Peter's Square turns into a sea of candles and grief. As dusk fell over the eternal city, St. Peter's Square became a living mosaic of mourning. Thousands of people flooded into the square, holding candles, photos of the Pope, and handwritten prayers. The gentle hum of Ave Maria echoed through the square, sung softly in dozens of languages. From young pilgrims to elderly nuns, the crowd stood shoulder to shoulder, united by sorrow and reverence. The Swiss Guard, cloaked in ceremonial black, stood at attention while flowers piled beneath the central obelisk. The Vatican had ordered the papal apartment to be sealed, an ancient tradition marking the end of a pontificate. Above it, the flag flew at half-mast. People whispered stories of Pope Francis feeding the poor, washing prisoners' feet, and hugging children with disabilities. Many wept openly. In that holy square, time itself seemed to pause. This wasn't just mourning. It was communion, the world crying out in unison. The white casket. A simple farewell for a humble soul. In keeping with his wishes, Pope Francis was laid to rest in a white cedarwood casket, free of gold or embellishment. Carved with a single crucifix and engraved with Psalm 23, the casket reflected his lifelong vow of simplicity. During his papacy, he rejected riches, choosing plain vestments and modest transportation. He wanted no throne, no marble, just a wooden box and a prayer, one cardinal whispered. The casket was carried by 12 Vatican pallbearers across the basilica floor, passing beneath the towering dome where popes had prayed for centuries. Around it, cardinals, bishops, and the faithful knelt in silent prayer. The image was unforgettable. A man who'd led the Church for over a decade, now returning to dust, in a casket no more elaborate than a carpenter's bench. In that simplicity, Francis offered his final sermon, one of humility, peace, and return to the Father. World leaders mourn. Obama, Macron, Lula, and others send tributes. The death of Pope Francis transcended religion, reaching the heart of global politics. Within hours, tributes poured in from presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs. Former U.S. President Barack Obama released an emotional statement. He stood for the poor, the forgotten, and the planet. We have lost a moral giant. French President Emmanuel Macron called him a compass in a stormy world, while Brazil's Lula da Silva declared 3 days of national mourning. Even leaders from nations with small Catholic populations recognized his impact. Pope Francis had championed peace in Syria, climate action, and interfaith dialogue with Islam and Judaism. The Dalai Lama wrote of their last meeting, "He radiated peace." The UN held a moment of silence. From Washington to Nairobi, Buenos Aires to Manila, flags flew at half-mast. For a moment, the world remembered what it meant to listen to conscience, not just doctrine, a pope of the people. Stories that emerged after his death. After the news of Pope Francis's death broke, a wave of untold stories flooded the internet, revealing a man far more profound than even the public had known. One account came from a janitor in the Vatican who shared how Francis once helped him mop a hallway late at night after a pipe had burst. Another came from a child with cerebral palsy whose family said the Pope wrote to them monthly, always sending books and toys. A former inmate wrote about the day Pope Francis washed his feet and whispered, "You are not forgotten by God." These were not press releases or staged photo ops. These were quiet acts of kindness that reflected a man devoted to service beyond spectacle. Even within the Vatican, some cardinals admitted they had underestimated his humility. As stories continued to emerge, a global portrait formed, one of a pope who lived what he preached. Inside the Vatican walls, the final hours before he died. The final hours of Pope Francis were spent in a private chamber inside the Apostolic Palace, surrounded by trusted aides, a personal physician, and Maria Elena. According to Vatican insiders, the Pope had been unwell for days but refused hospitalization, stating, "Let me die where I served." He asked for a simple meal, bread and olive oil, and later requested to hear sacred music by Bach and Gregorian chants. Moments before his breathing slowed, he reached for his rosary, clutched it, and murmured, "Peace, peace, forgive them." It is said he repeated Psalm 51, the Miserere, one of his favorite prayers of repentance. He asked for his last confession, then smiled and whispered a name, perhaps his late grandmother or Saint Francis. The monitors beeped slower and slower until silence filled the room. There was no drama, no fear, only peace, the kind he spent his life trying to give the world. His private chapel, a sanctuary of light, now a room of mourning. Tucked away behind the papal residence, Francis maintained a small private chapel that few outsiders ever entered. After his death, Vatican staff opened its doors, revealing a humble space adorned not with gold, but with clay crosses, handwritten notes from children, and a weathered statue of Saint Francis of Assisi. The altar was still marked by his last Eucharist. A faint smell of incense lingered. Here, he had knelt every morning at 5 a.m., sometimes weeping as he prayed for war victims, abuse survivors, and lost souls. Now candles lined the floor, flickering shadows against the painted ceiling. Maria Elena entered alone, kissed the foot of the crucifix, and sobbed into her palms. Outside, the clergy rotated in silence, each taking turns kneeling in grief. This chapel had once been a sanctuary of spiritual warfare. Now it was a tomb of echoes, a final resting place for his soul's most vulnerable hours. The Vatican's ancient funeral ritual begins. At precisely 6 a.m., the bells of St. Peter's rang 88 times, once for each year of Pope Francis' life. The funeral rituals, dictated by centuries of Vatican tradition, began with the rite of commendation. Clad in red and white, the College of Cardinals processed solemnly into the basilica, each carrying a candle. Francis' white casket was placed before the high altar. A book of the Gospels lay open on top, fluttering slightly as if turned by an invisible hand. The Rogito, a scroll summarizing his papal life and deeds, was read aloud and sealed inside the coffin. Next came the Novem Dialis, a 9-day mourning period with special masses and prayers. Every cardinal wore black with red trim, a symbol of sorrow touched by the blood of sacrifice. While Francis had wished for simplicity, the Church ensured dignity. After all, this wasn't just the end of a man, it was the closing of a divine chapter. Cardinal Tagle's emotional homily. He walked where Jesus walked. During the main funeral mass, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stepped forward to deliver the homily. A personal confidant of Francis, his voice trembled as he spoke. He walked where Jesus walked, not just in Rome, but in the slums, the jails, the refugee camps. Tagle recounted their years of shared service, their tears over scandals, and their laughter over simple joys. He told me once, "Luis, if the shepherd smells more like gold than his sheep, he has lost his calling." And he lived that calling. Tagle paused to regain composure, tears streaking down his face. This world does not need more power. It needs more Francis. The congregation, including world leaders and priests from over 140 nations, sat in stunned silence. As Tagle finished, he looked to the casket and whispered in Latin, "Servus Dei, requiescat in pace." Servant of God, rest in peace. It was both a eulogy and a benediction. Global leaders gather in Vatican. A world united in grief. As the Vatican opened its gates for Pope Francis's funeral, an extraordinary coalition of global leaders arrived to pay tribute. US President Joe Biden, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and representatives from countries as diverse as the Philippines, South Korea, Brazil, and the Democratic Republic of Congo all took their seats beneath the towering arches of St. Peter's Basilica. Muslim leaders from Iran and Turkey stood shoulder to shoulder with rabbis from Jerusalem, and even Tibetan monks made the journey, standing in saffron robes beside Catholic bishops. It was a visual symbol of the bridge Francis had built between faiths. Many of these leaders had met with him personally, often behind closed doors, and spoke afterward about the quiet power of his presence. Pope Francis may have worn white, but in the end, his heart had room for every color. His funeral became a mosaic of humanity. Maria Elena's private goodbye, the last sister's farewell. In a deeply intimate moment not captured by cameras but confirmed by close aides, Maria Elena Bergoglio, Pope Francis's only surviving sibling, was allowed a final private moment before his body was sealed in its tomb. She entered the chapel quietly, carrying with her a photograph of their childhood in Buenos Aires and a letter she had written years ago, but never had the courage to give him. She whispered it aloud now. "You've always been my brother before you were Pope," she said, her voice cracking. "And now, you're the light I'll follow home." She placed the photo on his chest and gently tucked the letter beneath his folded hands. In that moment, the silence was not hollow. It was sacred. The guards turned away, allowing her to grieve freely. When she finally emerged, her face was pale, her eyes red, but her spirit unbroken. She had said goodbye, but not forgotten. The coffin procession. Through the streets of Rome. Pope Francis's final journey through the Eternal City was nothing short of monumental. As his simple wooden coffin, lined with cypress and bearing only a crucifix and the papal seal, was lifted onto the ceremonial platform, tens of thousands lined the streets of Rome. People from every age, race, and faith stood in reverent silence. Some clutched rosaries, others waved white handkerchiefs. The Vatican Swiss Guard led the way, followed by a slow cadence of choir boys singing Salve Regina. As the procession reached the Tiber River, doves were released from the rooftop of Castel Sant'Angelo, rising into the gray sky above. An elderly woman whispered, "He was the last good shepherd." Storefronts closed in respect, and even the secular cafes paused their service. For one brief, aching hour, the chaos of modern Rome bowed before the memory of a man who had once dared to change it. A Vatican divided, tensions beneath the mourning veil. Even as the Vatican dressed itself in solemnity, beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Some conservative cardinals, long critical of Francis's progressive reforms, were already whispering about the conclave to come. Would they reverse his legacy? Undo his work on LGBTQ+ inclusion, interfaith dialogue, and climate action? Behind closed doors, factions maneuvered quietly, shaping alliances for the coming vote. But not everyone was focused on politics. Others genuinely mourned the loss of a man who had challenged the very culture of silence within the Vatican. Cardinal Zuppi called for unity, warning, "If we forget what he stood for, we bury more than a man. We bury his mission." The contrast was striking. While the outside world wept, inside the marble halls of power, the gears of succession had already begun turning. Even in death, Pope Francis stirred disruption. And that, in a way, was the truest sign that his spirit lived on. The world watches, a global funeral broadcast like no other. Over 1.8 billion viewers tuned in across every continent as the funeral of Pope Francis was broadcast live, a testament to his global reach. Major networks aired the ceremony uninterrupted, while digital platforms translated the Mass into dozens of languages. In a refugee camp in Syria, families watched huddled around an old television powered by a generator. In Argentina, his birthplace, people filled city squares to witness the liturgy. Even in parts of China where Catholicism is tightly monitored, thousands managed to access live streams via VPN. Social media was flooded with tributes, art, music, and heartfelt videos. Hashtags like "Thank You Francis" and "Pope of Peace" trended for days. For a few hours, the world felt smaller, united not by commerce or war, but by grief and grace. Pope Francis had always dreamed of a church that went to the margins. And in death, even the margins came to him, weeping, watching, remembering.